I was halfway through signing a redevelopment agreement when I saw her. At first, I didn't recognize her. That part is important. Memory has a way of rearranging moments afterward, making recognition feel instant when it rarely is. But in that first second, she was simply another waitress crossing the dining room floor with a tray balanced carefully between both hands. What caught my attention was the way she moved. Not slow exactly, just careful, one shoulder slightly lowered, as if she were protecting her balance. The restaurant was loud in the polished, expensive way places like that usually are. Silverware tapping softly against plates, low jazz drifting somewhere above the bar. A group near the windows laughing too loudly at something that probably wasn't very funny. It was Valentine's week, I think. Red arrangements sat on every other table. Someone had gone a little too far with candlelight. The whole room looked softened by it, and still something about that moment felt wrong. I had been sitting at the corner booth at Belmere House in downtown Charlotte with my longtime business partner, Victor Hale. We were reviewing the final contract for a redevelopment parcel we planned to close the next morning. 9 figures in projected build-out. The sort of deal that used to sharpen my focus immediately. There was a time when I could walk into a room full of lenders, attorneys, and city officials and feel the entire structure of the conversation before anyone spoke. That night, though, my hands were unsteady. Not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Victor always paid attention to things that might slow down a deal. "Arthur," he said, tapping the lower corner of the contract with one manicured finger. "You've been staring at page 14 for 3 full minutes." I looked down at the page as if I had been reviewing it carefully. The numbers were correct. The language had already been negotiated. The signatures were the only step remaining. There was no reason to delay, and yet the pen hovered above the paper. For several months, I had been experiencing a strange physical sensation that was difficult to explain. Not dizziness exactly. More like the room shifting slightly, as if the floor beneath it had been nudged half an inch to the side. I blamed stress at first, then diet, then workload. Men who run large companies are very good at turning symptoms into scheduling problems. "I'm fine," I said. Victor leaned back in the booth, clearly unconvinced. "We need this signed tonight," he said. "The sellers are already nervous." I might have answered him. I'm not completely sure. Because that was when the waitress stepped closer with a glass pitcher in one hand, and I finally looked up at her face. For a second, I genuinely thought I was mistaken. The face was thinner than I remembered, paler, drawn in a way that suggested months of quiet strain. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, nothing like the neat style she used to wear when she came to Sunday dinners at my house. I used to notice that kind of thing. She would arrive with a folder under one arm, ready to discuss some operational detail she thought Daniel should address. And she always carried the same small, patient half-smile whenever my son spoke confidently about numbers he hadn't actually checked. But the woman standing beside our table was unmistakably her, Emily, my daughter-in-law. The woman my son had told me disappeared 8 months earlier after draining several accounts and leaving behind a note that sounded, even at the time, strangely unfinished. Daniel said she ran away. That was the word he used. At the time, I accepted it because the explanation arrived cleanly and quickly, and I had work waiting on my desk the next morning. Looking back, I'm not sure whether that was trust or convenience. Emily was visibly pregnant now, far enough along that it changed the entire shape of the moment, and she looked at me with a kind of fear that rearranges a room. That's when the room went quiet. Not literally, of course. The music continued. Someone near the bar kept talking. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere behind me. But in my mind, the entire dining room narrowed into a single line between where I sat and where she stood holding that water pitcher with both hands. "Good evening," she said quietly. "Can I start you with still or sparkling?" Victor glanced up, mildly irritated at the interruption, then looked back down at the contract. He didn't know her well enough to recognize her. To him, she was simply another server interrupting an expensive dinner. I looked at her face again and felt something heavy settle in my chest. "Emily," I said. Her fingers tightened around the pitcher handle. It's a strange thing seeing someone step back into a story you already believed had ended. Not quite like seeing a ghost, more like opening a file you thought had been closed and archived months ago. She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward mine for half a second, then moved away again. "Sir," she said carefully, "would you like more time with the menu?" She was asking me not to say her name again. At the time, I didn't analyze that thought in any organized way. I simply felt it, the request inside the sentence, the warning inside the politeness. Some people mistake silence for permission. That thought passed through my mind then, though I couldn't yet decide who it belonged to. Victor cleared his throat. "Still water is fine." She poured for him first. Her hand trembled slightly, enough that a few drops spilled onto the tablecloth. Then she filled my glass. As she placed it down, I noticed a faint bruise near her wrist, mostly hidden by the sleeve of the uniform. I looked up again, but she had already stepped back. "Emily," I said more quietly. That was when everything changed. She turned and walked away, moving a little too quickly for someone in her condition. Not fast enough to attract attention, but fast enough that anyone who recognized fear could see it for what it was. She disappeared through the service doors leading into the kitchen. Victor exhaled through his nose. "Do we have a problem I don't know about?" I kept my eyes on the kitchen doors. "My son told me she left the state." Victor's expression shifted slightly. "Well," he said after a moment, "apparently she didn't." I set the pen down on the table. Victor noticed that before he noticed anything else. "Arthur, I'll be back." "You're walking away from the closing?" I stood slowly. The brief dizziness returned for a moment, then settled. Victor's jaw tightened. "This is not the time for family theatrics." That word stayed with me. Theatrics. I looked down at the contract again, then at the kitchen doors. "If she is here," I said quietly, "then something about the last 8 months is wrong." Victor gave me the look people use when they believe momentum matters more than accuracy. "You can call Daniel later," he said. "Sign now." But that was exactly the problem. Daniel had already spoken, and I had accepted his version without asking many questions. People with crowded calendars are especially vulnerable to clean explanations. I stepped around the table. Victor lowered his voice. "If this becomes a scene, it won't." I said it calmly, because calm usually carries more authority than outrage in public spaces. The service doors opened briefly as another waiter passed through carrying desserts. Heat and kitchen noise spilled out for a moment, then disappeared again. I could smell garlic, butter, dish soap, and hot metal. Real work. Emily was somewhere behind those doors, 8 months pregnant, hiding inside a restaurant 2 blocks from an office tower my company owned. Meanwhile, my son had spent months telling everyone she had vanished. Later, I realized that detail mattered more than I understood at the time. She hadn't left the city. She had simply disappeared inside its machinery. I took one step toward the kitchen. Victor spoke again, sharper this time. "Arthur, if you walk away from this table tonight, the deal may not survive." I turned back toward him. "I'm beginning to think," I said slowly, "that if I stay at this table, something else may not survive." He didn't answer. Neither did I. All I knew was that the order of things had changed. The contract could wait. The closing could be rescheduled. But if fear had a face, I had just seen it wearing my family's last name. I pushed through the service doors and stepped into the kitchen. The kitchen was easily 20 degrees hotter than the dining room. Steam hung beneath the metal exhaust hoods. Someone was calling for salmon at the pass. Plates moved quickly under bright lights while a printer rattled off tickets in short, impatient bursts. For a few seconds, no one noticed me. A dishwasher near the back paused with a rack half lifted and stared, as if I had walked through the wrong door. I've spent most of my life entering rooms where conversations stop when I arrive. Boardrooms, construction trailers, municipal offices. A restaurant kitchen works differently. It respects motion, not authority. So I kept moving. A sous chef I vaguely recognized from private catering events started toward me, then hesitated. Beyond him, near a dry storage alcove beside a stack of flour bins, I saw her. Emily stood with one hand pressed against the wall, the other covering her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. At that moment, I still believed there might be some explanation that would leave something salvageable behind. A misunderstanding. A separation that had turned messy. Financial stress. Pride. Families break in ordinary ways all the time. Then she looked up. I had seen Emily cry exactly once before that night, and even then she had done it quietly, almost apologetically. This was different. This wasn't grief. It was calculation collapsing under pressure. "Don't," she said quickly before I spoke. "Please don't say my name out here." So I stopped about 6 feet away. Distance matters in moments like that. Too close feels like control. Too far feels like indifference. "All right," I said calmly. "Then tell me what I should call you." For a moment her breath caught in her throat. It almost turned into a laugh, though not quite. "You shouldn't have followed me. I wasn't going to let you disappear twice." Her face changed slightly at that. Not softened, tightened. I didn't disappear. There it was. The first clean fracture in Daniel's version of events. A line cook carrying a tray brushed past behind me and muttered an apology. The order printer near the counter spit out another string of tickets. The kitchen manager glanced in our direction, trying to decide whether this conversation belonged to him. Something in my expression must have answered the question, because he turned away again. "Come somewhere quieter," Emily said. She led me down a narrow service corridor that smelled faintly of bleach and fryer oil. A metal shelving rack held stacks of paper goods along one wall. At the far end, an emergency exit door waited under a red push bar. Under the fluorescent lighting, she looked even more exhausted than she had in the dining room. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that comes from long weeks without rest. I waited. She spoke first. "Did Daniel tell you I stole from the company?" "Yes." She nodded once, as if confirming something she already expected. "And that I left him?" "Yes. And that I was unstable." I hesitated slightly. "He suggested it." She closed her eyes briefly. Just 1 second. Then she opened them again and looked directly at me in a way she never had when she was still living in Daniel's house. "He wanted me gone before I started keeping copies." The sentence arrived plainly. Truth rarely announces itself dramatically. Most of the time it arrives quietly and waits to see if someone will recognize it. "Copies of what?" I asked. She glanced toward the exit door at the end of the corridor, listening for footsteps. "Wire transfers, vendor substitutions, fake consulting fees." Her voice steadied slightly as she continued. "He moved money through holding accounts tied to one of your development entities. He assumed no one would question the overlap. That level of detail is difficult to invent." I placed my hand lightly against the wall beside me as another brief wave of dizziness passed through. It lasted only a second or two, Emily noticed. Her expression shifted from fear to concern. "How often has that been happening?" she asked. "Enough," I said. "Not enough to matter." "It matters." There was no hesitation in her voice when she said that. No daughter-in-law politeness, just correction. I remember noticing that. How many times had I mistaken courtesy for passivity? A timer buzzed somewhere in the kitchen behind us. A cart rattled across uneven tile. "When did you leave the house?" I asked. "I didn't leave," she said. Not the way he told it. That was the first backstory she gave me. She described a Tuesday morning late last summer. Breakfast room windows open. Lawn crews working outside. Coffee going cold between them. Daniel stood at the counter scrolling through his phone while she held a printed ledger in her hand. A yellow sticky note marked 3 transfers she couldn't reconcile. She asked him, "Why is Horizon Civic paying Sterling Advisory?" He didn't look up immediately. Just took a sip of coffee and said, "Because that's how restructuring works." She told him the entity was dormant. That was when he finally looked up and smiled. Not warmly, patiently. The way people smile when they've already decided they will be believed. The memory ended there. In the corridor, Emily lifted the sleeve of her uniform slightly. A bruise darkened the inside of her forearm. "He didn't have to hit hard," she said quietly. "He just had to make everything uncertain." I looked down the corridor floor for a moment before answering. "Did he ever strike you directly?" She gave me a tired look. "You're asking like a lawyer." "No," I said. "I'm asking like someone who wants to know what can be proven." That seemed to steady her more than sympathy would have. Yes, she said. Another cart passed the corridor entrance. Someone laughed loudly in the kitchen. When he realized I had records, she continued, he changed tactics. That was the second memory, rain tapping against upstairs windows. One lamp lit in the dressing room outside the bedroom. Brooke stood in the doorway wearing one of Emily's silk robes. Daniel sorted cufflinks at the dresser behind her. Emily had said, "You can't do this while I'm still living here," Daniel answered without turning around. "Apparently I can. Some sentences sound harmless until you place them in the correct room." I looked down the corridor again, noticing the scuffed baseboard and the faint wheel marks from delivery carts. "Who else knows?" I asked. No one who helped. Her hand rested protectively against her stomach. "I tried going to the hospital once," she said. "I saw one of Daniel's people in the lobby and left before check-in." That sentence produced the next pressure beat naturally. I looked away for a moment. Shame has a physical effect. It redirects the eyes. Because by then I had begun to understand what she was really telling me. Not just that Daniel had betrayed her, but that I had helped make the betrayal easier by accepting his version of events and returning to work. "How did you end up here?" I asked. She gave a small shrug. "I used a different last name, paid cash for a room until the money ran out. Then one of the prep cooks told me the restaurant needed servers. You could have called me." The sentence came out harsher than I intended. She looked at me for a long moment. Could I? There wasn't a respectable answer to that. The question opened the third memory. She reminded me of a Sunday afternoon at my house several years earlier. The grill outside still smoking, football playing too loudly in the den. Emily stood beside me at the kitchen island with a folder of audit notes, while Daniel opened a bottle of wine he hadn't paid for. She pointed to a discrepancy and said, "This pattern repeats every quarter." I had told her, without looking up long enough, "Run it by Daniel first. He knows the operating side." She looked at me now and said quietly, "I did run it by him, Arthur. I could almost smell the cedar smoke from that afternoon." "What records do you still have?" I asked. Her expression changed slightly. "Some. Where?" She shook her head. "If I tell you now and you go straight to him, I'm finished. I'm not going straight to him." "How do I know?" "Fair question." "Because I'm still standing in a service corridor," I said, "while a contract worth hundreds of millions sits unsigned on my table." For the first time that night, something in her expression softened. "There's more," she said quietly. I assumed there was. She lowered her voice. "He wasn't just moving money." I waited. She glanced at my hand against the wall. "Arthur, your spells, the shaking, the confusion. Did that start before or after Brooke moved in?" "After." She nodded slowly. "He had her preparing your supplements." I felt the corridor narrow slightly. "Say that again," she added. "Powders," Emily said. Said older men decline quickly when they're under stress. The lawyer looked up and paused. Except there was no lawyer there yet. Just me. And suddenly the two separate rooms in my mind, my health and my son's household, were no longer separate. "Did you see it yourself?" I asked. "Yes." "Did Daniel know what it was?" "Yes." Her calm frightened me more than panic would have. A delivery alarm sounded somewhere in the kitchen. Someone shouted for more ice. The dining room beyond the walls continued in its quiet rhythm. Institutions do that well. They continue. I took a slow breath. "All right," I said. Emily watched me carefully. "Here's what happens next." Emily watched me closely, as if measuring whether those words actually meant anything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fluorescent light above the corridor hummed softly, the kind of steady electrical sound you only notice when everything else goes quiet. Then she asked, cautiously, "What happens next?" "You don't go home," I said. The answer came out calm and precise, not emotional, not dramatic, procedural. "You don't leave with anyone you know," I continued. "You don't answer calls from Daniel or from anyone speaking for him." Her eyes searched my face, trying to understand whether this was protection or control. "You finish whatever you need to here tonight without attracting attention," I said. "Then I move you somewhere private." She studied that for a moment. "And then?" "And then," I said quietly, "I verify everything." Her expression shifted slightly. That sounds cold. It's procedural, I said. Cold would be doing nothing. Something about that answer seemed to settle her. People who have been dismissed repeatedly stop trusting emotional reassurance. They trust structure. A server pushed open the corridor door behind us. Emily, table 12 needs, I'll cover 12, I said before he could finish. The young man blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to that. Then, because tone matters more than explanation in places like that, he nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. Emily looked at me with something close to disbelief. You're serious? Yes. About all of this? Yes. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. I took my phone from my pocket and opened a message thread with Martin. Need discreet meeting tonight. Family and corporate exposure. No email. I sent it. Then I looked back at her. Do you have identification with you? Yes. Any records on paper? A few. Digital? She nodded. Good. Pressure follows evidence. The moment someone decides to preserve information instead of ignore it, everyone involved becomes more dangerous. I need one more answer, I said. What? Is the child Daniel's? Her expression didn't change. Yes. There are situations where that question feels morally unnecessary and legally essential. This was one of them. All right, I said. She drew a slow breath. I was waiting for the right moment to leave with the records, she explained. I thought I had more time to organize everything. What changed? He found one of the printouts. The corridor seemed to grow quieter around us. What happened after that? I asked. He didn't yell, she said. That would have been easier. Instead, she described the moment almost clinically. Daniel standing on the staircase overlooking the foyer. Brooke leaning against the railing beside him. Emily near the laundry door holding a bag she had packed quickly. He watched me leave, she said. What did he say? She looked directly at me. He said the company would be easier to run once you were gone. The sentence settled in the air between us. Then she added something else. He told Brooke not to worry about the tea anymore. There it was again, the tea, the tremors, the dizziness. My mind began connecting pieces that had never previously occupied the same conversation. I leaned back slightly against the corridor wall. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said quietly, All right. Emily waited. What does that mean? She asked. It means Daniel has already made a mistake. What mistake? He assumed I would react emotionally. She studied me carefully. But you're not. No. The kitchen noise beyond the door continued, plates, voices, timers. Ordinary life continuing inside a building where something far less ordinary had just been revealed. What do you want me to do now? She asked. Finish your shift. She blinked. You want me to keep serving tables? Yes. That's insane. It's strategic. She crossed her arms slightly. Explain. If Daniel believes tonight is still ordinary, I said, he won't accelerate anything. She considered that for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. You think he's watching? I think he assumes he controls the narrative. And he doesn't? No. The difference between control and assumption is often invisible until paperwork appears. I stepped toward the corridor entrance. I'm going back to the dining room, I said. I need to close out my presence there without signaling anything unusual. Emily looked uncertain. You're really going to sit back down at that table? Yes. And the contract? It can wait. She studied me for another moment. Arthur. Yes. I should have told you sooner. I paused. You should have been able to. The distinction mattered. Then I stepped back into the kitchen. The heat hit me immediately. A server rushed past carrying a tray of desserts. Someone cursed at a malfunctioning printer. Life inside the restaurant had continued without interruption. When I pushed through the service doors into the dining room again, Victor was already standing beside the booth with his coat draped over one arm. The unsigned contract rested beneath his hand. His expression told me he had already decided I was the unreasonable one. Well? He asked. I reached for my wallet and placed several bills on the table for the meal. We're not signing tonight. Victor stared at me. You can't be serious. I am. This deal took 6 months to structure. I know. And you're walking away because your daughter-in-law suddenly appears in a restaurant. Yes. His voice dropped. This is bigger than your family. No, I said calmly. That may be the problem. Victor exhaled sharply. You walk away now and the sellers will interpret it as instability. I looked once more toward the kitchen doors. Then they're reading the wrong file. I picked up my coat and stepped away from the booth. Victor didn't follow. When I walked outside into the cool February air, the city felt strangely quiet. Not empty, just distant. I stood there for a moment beside the valet stand, thinking about everything Emily had said. The missing funds, the bruises, the tea, and the single sentence Daniel had spoken while she left the house. The company would be easier to run once you were gone. At the time, I didn't yet know whether that sentence was arrogance or confession, but I did know one thing. I was done asking Daniel what happened. From that moment forward, I was going to verify it myself. By the time I reached my car, the night air had cooled enough to clear my head a little. Charlotte in February can do that. Not cold enough to sting, just sharp enough to wake a person up. The valet had already pulled my sedan around, probably because Victor assumed we were leaving together. The young man holding the keys looked uncertain when I approached alone. Everything all right, sir? I nodded and handed him a folded bill without answering. People ask that question constantly without wanting the real answer. Most of the time, it's just a social reflex, a line people say while already looking past you. When I sat down behind the wheel, I didn't start the engine right away. I rested both hands on the steering wheel and let the silence settle. There is a moment after new information arrives when the mind tries to return to its previous shape, a kind of administrative denial. A quiet effort to put everything back where it was 5 minutes earlier. I felt that for a moment. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe Daniel had already corrected whatever this was. Maybe there was some explanation involving taxes or restructuring, or one of those messy business maneuvers that sounds questionable until legal reviews catch up to it. Then I remembered the bruise near her wrist, and the way she asked about my symptoms. I started the car. Instead of driving home, I turned east and headed toward Caldwell Civic Tower. It's one of the office buildings my company developed years ago, mostly law firms and consulting suites now. My general counsel, Martin Shaw, keeps a small evening office there for matters that don't belong on email. When I sent that message from the service corridor, I knew he would understand the tone. Martin has been my lawyer for nearly 20 years. He's the kind of man who reads silence the way other people read contracts. I've trusted him with property battles, union threats, failed partnerships, and one very ugly acquisition attempt that should have ended in court but didn't. I parked in the underground garage and noticed the faint lightness in my hands again when I reached for the door handle. The tremor was still there, subtle but unmistakable. Emily's words came back immediately. Tea, supplements. I sat there a second longer than I needed to. Later I realized that was the moment suspicion crossed into procedure. Not belief, exactly, just acceptance that the allegation had to be tested seriously. I took the elevator to the 10th floor. Martin was already waiting in the small conference room overlooking Tryon Street when I stepped out. He hadn't bothered with a jacket. Just white shirt sleeves, reading glasses low on his nose, and a tablet lying face down beside a yellow legal pad. When he saw my face, he closed whatever file he had been reviewing without asking what it was. Arthur. His voice had that steady professional tone lawyers use when they expect the evening has just become more expensive. You said family exposure. I sat down across from him and folded my hands on the table. Yes, he waited. That's one of the reasons I trust Martin. He never fills silence just because it exists. My daughter-in-law is alive, I said. He didn't react outwardly. Your son told us she left the state. So he did. Martin leaned back a little in his chair. Where is she now? Working in a restaurant 2 blocks from here. He nodded once, slowly. Does Daniel know you've seen her? No. Does she want him to know? No. He tapped one finger once against the tabletop, thinking. All right, he said. Tell me everything. So I did. I walked him through the corridor conversation piece by piece. The missing funds she described, the vendor substitutions, the holding accounts tied to Horizon Civic, The bruise, the pregnancy, the statement about powders in my tea and supplements. When I finished, the room sat quiet except for the faint hum of the building's air system and a siren somewhere below on the street. Martin removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the table. That's a complicated set of claims. Yes. Any documentation yet? Some. Where? She hasn't told me. He nodded again and drew the legal pad closer. That was the first formal move of the night. Not dramatic. Just a pen touching paper. He wrote in block letters, date, time, source of allegation, parties present. Then he looked up. Your symptoms, he said. Describe them. Dizziness, tremors, occasional confusion. How long? 6 months, maybe longer. Have you seen a doctor? Routine visits. Nothing conclusive. He wrote that down as well, slowly, as if the shape of the record mattered as much as the content. In legal matters, it usually does. Then he set the pen down and leaned forward. Arthur, if even half of this is accurate, we are no longer talking about a family dispute. I knew what was coming before he said it. This becomes attempted murder. The phrase landed with less drama than people imagine those words carry. In the hands of a competent lawyer, even the worst possibilities sound administrative. I let the sentence sit between us, hearing it spoken that plainly changed the temperature of the room. Before we move in that direction, Martin said, we verify. Agreed. We need 3 things immediately. He held up 3 fingers. Financial records, medical testing, safe placement for Emily. I nodded. All already in motion. That made him raise an eyebrow. Explain. She is finishing her shift tonight. I'll relocate her afterward. Where? One of the guest apartments in South Park. It's under a property manager's name. Martin wrote that down. Daniel's financial authority? He asked. Limited operational access. Final approvals still route through my office. That helps. He looked down at the legal pad, then back at me. We need to freeze certain discretionary transfers quietly. I knew exactly what he meant. Escrow positions, reserve access, vendor authorizations. Anything Daniel could move quickly if he sensed trouble. What about the Horizon Civic escrows? I asked. Martin opened the tablet and tapped through a few screens. There are 3 active positions. Flag them. Done. It was that simple on the surface. A few taps, a notation. A quiet hold placed deep inside a process no one notices until the money doesn't arrive where it was expected. He looked up again. There's another issue. What? Your son. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. You're not ready to confront him yet, Martin said. No. Good. He meant it. Because if he suspects anything, he continued, he may accelerate whatever he's doing. That word settled into the room heavily. Accelerate. Martin leaned back. We proceed quietly. My phone vibrated once against the table. A text from an unknown number. I looked down. It was Emily. Shift ending soon. I turned the phone so Martin could see it. Good, he said. Once she's secured, we move to verification. I put the phone away. Medical first, he said. I'll arrange a toxicology screen tonight. Private lab, quiet file. Discreet, I said. Always, he wrote again. I watched his handwriting for a moment and thought about how strange it is that so much of a family collapse eventually gets translated into legal shorthand. How much does a sentence lose when it becomes evidence? How much does it gain? Martin stood and walked toward the window. Traffic below moved steadily through downtown. Brake lights. Office workers, couples heading to dinner, delivery vans. Normal life continuing without the slightest awareness that an entire internal structure had just begun to shift. That's another thing, he said, still looking out. If Emily has records, Daniel may already know something is missing. I've thought about that, which means social pressure starts soon. He turned back toward me. Coworkers hear things. Neighbors notice cars. Family members start checking in. Information leaks through the edges before it ever reaches the center. He was right. By then, Victor knew enough to speculate. Restaurant staff had seen me walk into the kitchen. Daniel had likely already built part of his public version in advance. We needed to move before narrative hardened. I've always admired your ability to stay calm in a crisis, Martin said. This isn't calm. No? It's procedure. That earned the faintest hint of a smile from him. Then he sat down again, folded his hands, and said, "There's one rule you need to keep in mind over the next few weeks." "What rule?" "Institutions move slowly," he said, "until they don't." I understood that immediately. I had spent a lifetime building companies around that exact principle. Slow review, delayed response, then sudden enforcement. My phone vibrated again. This time the message was from Daniel. "Hey Dad, haven't heard from you today. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen for a second. Martin noticed. "Your son?" "Yes. Don't answer yet." I turned the phone face down on the table. Some people mistake silence for permission. That thought returned to me again. Martin looked at me. "And sometimes," he said, "they mistake patience for weakness." I nodded once. Then I stood. "I need to pick Emily up." Martin walked me to the door. "Arthur." "Yes." When the paperwork catches up to him. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because we both knew what happens when financial records, medical reports, and witness statements start aligning inside the same file. That's when the room goes quiet. I took the elevator back down to the garage and started the car again. As I pulled out onto the street, one thought stayed with me. Daniel still believed this was a family problem. He hadn't realized yet that it was becoming an institutional one. I reached the restaurant a few minutes before Emily's shift ended. Belmere House had quieted considerably since dinner service. The early crowd had gone, and the later tables were smaller couples lingering over wine, a few business conversations running longer than intended. The kind of calm that settles over a restaurant once the first rush has passed. I parked along the curb instead of using the valet this time. For a moment I stayed in the car. The restaurant's front windows reflected the streetlights and passing headlights in long streaks across the glass. People moved inside in slow, quiet patterns, servers collecting plates, a bartender wiping down the counter, someone laughing near the back table. It all looked perfectly normal. And yet nothing about the evening felt normal anymore. I sat there with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle again. When a situation begins shifting into institutional territory, patience becomes more valuable than urgency. That's something most people misunderstand. They assume action must be immediate and visible. But often the most effective move is simply to wait while systems align behind the scenes. My phone buzzed once. A message from the property manager. "Apartment ready. Good." That handled the first practical problem placement. I stepped out of the car just as the restaurant door opened. Emily came out a moment later. She had changed out of the uniform and into a gray coat that no longer hid the pregnancy very well. Her hair was pulled back again, though less carefully than earlier. The exhaustion of a full shift showed clearly now. When she saw me, she stopped for half a second. Not fear this time. Surprise. I walked toward her. "Everything goes smoothly?" She nodded. "Mostly." The word hung there with a little tension attached to it. "What happened?" One of the other servers asked if I was feeling okay. And? I told her I was tired. That believable? She gave a small, tired smile. "I'm 8 months pregnant, Arthur. Exhaustion is believable." I opened the passenger door for her. "We're not going far." She hesitated briefly before getting in. Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It usually builds through small confirmations that someone does what they say they will do. I walked around the car and slid into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, she looked down at her hands. "I didn't expect you to come back tonight." "Why not?" "Because most people would need time to think." I pulled away from the curb and eased into traffic. Thinking already happened. That wasn't entirely true. But it was close enough. We drove in silence for a couple of blocks. Then she spoke again. "What did your lawyer say?" I glanced at her briefly. "You assumed I would call one." "You're a man who solves problems through structure," she said. "That's what Daniel always said about you." I almost smiled. "He's not wrong." She nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" I turned toward Fairview Road. "Verification." She looked at me. "That sounds clinical." "It is." The streetlights passed across the windshield in steady intervals as we drove. "Financial records first," I said. Then medical confirmation. Her hand rested lightly against the side of her coat. "You believe me." "I believe the claims require investigation." That answer seemed to satisfy her more than emotional reassurance would have. People who have been ignored often trust procedure more than sympathy. 10 minutes later, we pulled into the underground garage of the South Park building. The property manager had left the side entrance unlocked as I requested. Emily followed me into the elevator. "Whose apartment is this?" she asked. "Mine." Her eyes flicked toward me. "I didn't know you had a place here. I don't advertise everything I own." The apartment itself was simple and rarely used. Neutral furniture. Wide windows overlooking the garage entrance. A small kitchen that had probably seen very little actual cooking. Emily stepped inside cautiously, looking around as if expecting someone else to appear. "No one else knows about this place," I said. That seemed to relax her slightly. She sat down on the couch with visible relief. I went to the kitchen and filled 2 glasses with water. When I handed one to her, she paused before drinking. The hesitation was small but noticeable. "Old habit?" I asked. She nodded. "Sorry." "No," I said. That reaction makes sense. She finished the glass and set it down carefully. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her bag. "This is part of it." She handed me a small flash drive. Evidence has a weight to it, even when it's only a few grams of plastic and metal. I turned it over in my hand. "What's on it?" "Transaction logs, vendor transfers, internal emails Daniel thought were deleted." I nodded. "That helps. Evidence changes behavior. Once records exist, assumptions begin losing their value." "Is that everything?" I asked. "No." "Where's the rest?" "In a storage locker." "Under whose name?" "Not mine." "Good." That meant she had already begun thinking defensively. "I'll have Martin review this tonight," I said. "Your lawyer?" "Yes." She leaned back into the couch and closed her eyes briefly. "You're taking this very calmly." "That's deliberate." Her eyes opened again. "Why?" "Because panic helps the wrong people." That answer seemed to settle something between us. I checked my phone again. 3 missed calls, all from Daniel. Interesting. Concern calls, tone management, early attempts to control narrative. I didn't return them. Instead, I opened the message thread and typed a short response. "Long meeting tonight. We'll call tomorrow." Then I set the phone down. Emily noticed. "He's worried." "Good." She looked surprised. "You want him worried?" "No," I said calmly. "I want him uncertain." She thought about that. "That's different." "Yes. Uncertainty forces people to reveal their next move." I checked the time. Almost midnight. Martin would already be reviewing the files, which meant the financial systems would begin shifting soon. Escrow monitoring, account flags, transfer logs. Quiet adjustments deep inside the company's internal controls. Emily shifted slightly on the couch. "I should tell you something else." I sat down across from her. "What is it?" "When I left the house that night," her voice slowed slightly, "Daniel didn't try to stop me. That caught my attention." "What do you mean?" He watched. "From where?" "The staircase." A memory crossed her face. "He said something while I was leaving." "What did he say?" She looked directly at me. "He said the company would be easier to run once you were gone." The room went quiet again. Not dramatically. Just the kind of quiet that arrives when a sentence suddenly explains several other things at once, Emily continued. "Then he told Brooke not to worry about the tea anymore." There it was again. The tea, the tremors, the dizziness. My mind began assembling pieces that had never previously occupied the same conversation. I leaned back slowly in the chair. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said quietly, "All right." Emily waited. "What does that mean?" "It means Daniel has already made a mistake." "What mistake?" He assumed I would react emotionally. She studied me carefully. "But you're not." "No." The clock on the kitchen wall ticked once, then again. I looked at the flash drive resting on the table. "You can't take what was never yours." The words came out quietly. Emily frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "if Daniel believes the company already belongs to him." I placed the flash drive on the table. "He hasn't looked closely enough at the paperwork." Outside the apartment window, a car passed slowly through the garage below. Emily leaned back again, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," I said, "the institutions start reading." She nodded slowly. For the first time that night, the tension in her shoulders eased. Across the room, my phone vibrated again. Another message from Daniel. "Dad, we need to talk." I let the screen go dark without opening it, because the truth was already moving. And Daniel still believed this was a family conversation. He hadn't realized yet that the financial systems had already started shifting. And once those systems begin moving, they rarely ask permission. The next morning began quietly. That's often how institutional tightening starts, not with confrontation, not with announcements, but with small movements inside systems most people never see. I woke early in the guest bedroom down the hall from the apartment living room. The blinds were half open, letting in the pale morning light that makes everything look temporarily uncomplicated. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then the previous evening returned in pieces. The corridor at Belmere House, the flash drive on the kitchen table, Emily asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled halfway over her, and Daniel's unanswered messages. I stepped into the living room carefully so I wouldn't wake her. The flash drive sat exactly where I had left it. My phone buzzed almost immediately. "Martin," I answered on the first ring. "Morning," he said. His voice already carried the tone of someone who had been working for hours. "You reviewed it?" "Yes." Evidence confirmation. And a brief pause. Then Martin said something very simple. "Your daughter-in-law underestimated how much she found." I sat down at the kitchen table. "How much?" 7 shell transfers. He spoke with the calm precision of someone reading numbers off a ledger. 3 vendor substitutions. 2 consulting contracts that appear entirely fabricated. And 1 routing chain that runs directly through Daniel's operational authority. I let the information settle for a moment. Amounts? Just over 6 million so far. Numbers carry weight, even when they're small compared to the size of a company. "That's enough for felony exposure," Martin added. "Yes. It's also enough to justify a compliance review." I understood immediately. Compliance review meant institutional tightening. "Have you triggered it?" I asked. Yes, the process had already begun. That would quietly alert 2 internal auditors and the external firm that handled our regulatory filings. No accusations yet, just a procedural review request. Daniel would eventually see it. Not immediately, but soon enough. "Medical?" I asked. Martin exhaled slowly. "I arranged the toxicology screen." "When?" "Today. Private lab." "Good." I glanced toward the couch. Emily was still asleep. Without the tension of the restaurant shift, she looked younger. Just a tired woman carrying more stress than anyone 8 months pregnant should have to manage. Martin continued. "There's something else." "What?" "The tea. That word again. We checked the supplement brand she mentioned," he said. "And? It's legitimate." That didn't surprise me. People who plan carefully rarely use obvious methods. But the capsules inside the container she described were replaced. I didn't respond immediately. "The lab will confirm the compound," he continued, "but based on the symptoms you described." He paused briefly. "Arsenic exposure is consistent." The apartment seemed quieter after that, not dramatically, just colder. Because the accusation had now moved 1 step closer to confirmation. "Daniel wouldn't know the chemistry," I said. "No," Martin agreed. "But someone advising him might. Brooke, or Lena as Emily had called her." I stood and walked toward the window. Morning traffic had begun moving through the garage entrance below. Commuters, delivery vans, a man jogging across the sidewalk with headphones in, normal life continuing. Meanwhile, the internal structure of my own life had begun rearranging itself. "Next step?" I asked. "Financial containment." Martin's voice returned to its procedural cadence. "Escrow accounts flagged overnight. 2 wire transfers attempted early this morning, both automatically delayed under compliance review." I allowed myself a small breath of relief. Institutions move slowly, until they don't. "Daniel will notice," I said. "Yes, soon, very soon." My phone buzzed again. "Daniel." This time it wasn't a text, it was a call. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I answered. "Morning, Dad." His voice sounded controlled, but there was tension beneath it. "You're up early," I said. I could say the same. A short pause. I tried calling last night. I was in meetings. I heard. That made me pause slightly. Heard from who? One of Victor's assistants. Information leakage. Office chatter. He continued. You walked away from the Belmere deal. Yes, that's unusual. Circumstances changed. Another pause. Then he asked the question I expected. Dad, did you see Emily last night? I kept my voice steady. Yes. The silence on the other end lasted a fraction too long. Then he said carefully, That's not possible. She was serving tables. Another pause. Dad, she left the state months ago. No. I let the words settle quietly. No, she didn't. I could almost hear him recalculating. Then Daniel's voice shifted slightly. Did she tell you anything? Yes. Another silence. Then he laughed. A short, controlled laugh. Dad, you know how unstable she's been. I know what she told me, and you believe her? I believe it requires investigation. That sentence cooled the conversation immediately. Daniel recognized procedural language when he heard it. Investigation, he repeated. Yes. What exactly are you investigating? I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Financial discrepancies. Another pause. How long have you been looking into this? Since last night. Daniel exhaled sharply. That's ridiculous. Is it? You're going to trust someone who stole company money over your own son? I let that sit for a moment. Then I said quietly, Daniel, yes, 2 wire transfers you attempted this morning have already been delayed. The silence that followed was longer this time. Then he said very quietly, What did you do? I didn't do anything. That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. The compliance office is reviewing the accounts, I continued. And why would they do that? Because the paperwork already has your name on it. That's when everything changed. I heard his breathing shift on the other end of the line. Performance. Then calculation. Then the first hint of panic. You froze my accounts. No, I initiated a review. That's the same thing. No, I said calmly. It's procedure. He didn't answer for several seconds. When he spoke again, the tone was different, sharper. You're making a mistake. That's possible. You're letting her manipulate you. That's also possible. But the records will clarify. Records rarely argue. They simply exist. Daniel tried another approach. Dad, if this goes public, the company reputation will survive. You don't know that. Yes, I said quietly. I do. Another pause. Then his voice dropped lower. You should call me before you do anything else. I will. When? After the lab results. That stopped him. What lab results? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I said, Daniel, yes, you always believed the company was already yours. He didn't respond. You were wrong about that. Another silence. Then the call ended. I set the phone down. Across the room, Emily stirred on the couch, half awake. Was that him? She asked softly. Yes. What did he say? That we're making a mistake. She sat up slowly. And are we? I shook my head. No. My phone buzzed again. Martin, I answered. Yes. The lab confirmed it, he said. My hand tightened slightly around the phone. Arsenic. The word landed quietly in the room. Institutional tightening had officially begun. Daniel didn't know it yet. But once medical evidence entered the record, the situation stopped being a family dispute. It became a criminal file. I looked over at Emily, then back at the flash drive on the table. Martin, I said. Yes. Prepare the next step. He understood immediately. Compliance notice? Yes. And law enforcement liaison? Yes. He paused. Arthur, once we file that report, this won't stay inside the company anymore. I know. I ended the call and sat there for a moment. Sunlight now filled the apartment fully. Emily watched me quietly. What happens now? I folded my hands together. Now, I said calmly, the institutions stop waiting. And when that happens, panic usually arrives very quickly. Daniel just didn't know it yet. The shift from investigation to enforcement did not happen loudly. In fact, the first visible sign was paperwork. By mid-morning, Martin had already forwarded the toxicology report through 2 different channels. One went to our internal compliance office, attached to the financial irregularities that had surfaced overnight. The other moved through a quiet contact at the county prosecutor's office, someone Martin had worked with years earlier during a fraud case involving a construction supplier. Neither report accused Daniel directly. That detail matters. Institutions rarely accuse at first. They document. By the time Emily finished a small breakfast in the kitchen, toast, fruit, and tea I made myself, the structure had already begun tightening around him. She sat carefully at the table, moving a little slower than the night before. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "A few hours. That's more than I expected. I've slept less during zoning hearings," I said. That earned a faint smile. It was the first genuine one I had seen from her since the restaurant. My phone buzzed again. Martin had sent a document. Compliance review notice. The wording was simple. Neutral. The sort of administrative language that looks harmless until you understand what it triggers. Financial systems would now begin examining every discretionary transaction connected to Daniel's authority. Emily watched my expression. "What happened?" "The company is asking questions." She nodded slowly. "And Daniel? He'll know soon." The answer arrived faster than expected. My phone rang again. "Daniel," I answered. His voice was no longer calm. "What did you do?" "The same thing I told you yesterday. You filed a compliance review." "Yes." "You froze operations." "No." I asked the auditors to look. "That's the same thing." "No," I said quietly. "It's procedure. You're destroying the company over a lie." The anger in his voice was sharper now. I waited. Anger tends to burn itself out quickly when it has nothing to attach to. "Daniel," I said calmly, 3 vendor contracts routed through Sterling Advisory are not legitimate." He didn't respond. 2 wire transfers attempted to bypass escrow monitoring this morning. Still silence. And the medical lab confirmed arsenic exposure. That was the moment the temperature changed. The silence stretched longer than before. Then Daniel said slowly, "You think I poisoned you. I think the evidence suggests someone did. Emily told you that. She told me where to look." He laughed again. But the sound was thinner this time. "You've always trusted paperwork more than people." "That's not entirely true." "Oh?" "I trusted you." That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else I had said. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said quietly, "You're making a mistake." "I hope so. Because if you're wrong, I won't be." Another pause. Then the performance disappeared completely. "You should stop this now." "Why?" "You don't understand how complicated things are." "Then explain them." He didn't. Instead, he said something colder. "You think the company will survive a criminal investigation?" "Yes. And you?" "That's less important." The line remained silent for several seconds. Then Daniel spoke again, almost reflectively. "You know what your problem always was?" "What?" "You built systems that outlived people. That was intentional. And now those systems are turning on your own son." "No," said quietly. "They're revealing him." The call ended a few seconds later. Emily had been listening from across the room. "He knows," she said. "Yes. What happens next?" I leaned back in the chair. "Now he decides whether to run, negotiate, or comply." She looked uneasy. "Which one do you think he'll choose?" I considered that carefully. Daniel has always believed he could outmaneuver systems. So, run? Probably. That prediction proved accurate sooner than I expected. Around 2 hours later, Martin called again. "Arthur." "Yes. Daniel just attempted a brokerage liquidation." "How much?" "Everything he could access." "Was it blocked?" "Yes. Compliance flag and escrow locks." "Good. Anything else?" I asked. Martin hesitated slightly. "Yes." "What?" "He attempted to access the company legal archive." I sat up straighter. "For what?" "We don't know yet. But the system logged the attempt. That mattered. Every access request leaves a record. Law enforcement has been notified," Martin added. Once police involvement begins, the environment shifts quickly. Coworkers start whispering. Neighbors notice unfamiliar cars. Family members receive calls they weren't expecting. Emily watched my face carefully. "What happened?" Daniel tried to move money. Her shoulders tightened. "And?" He couldn't. Relief crossed her face briefly. Then another thought followed. "What about Brooke?" I hadn't heard her name since the corridor conversation. "We'll find out soon enough," I said. The answer arrived that afternoon. Around 3 o'clock, Martin called again, but this time his voice carried a different tone. Not tension, closure. They picked him up. I stood slowly. Where? Airport Access Road. That didn't surprise me. Trying to leave? Yes. With what? Laptop. Documents. 2 passports. I let out a slow breath. And Brooke? Already detained. How? A pharmacy technician identified the supplement purchases. So the institutional lanes had finally converged. Financial, medical, witness testimony. Daniel had believed the company already belonged to him, but the paperwork still carried my authority. You can't take what was never yours. Emily stood quietly across the room. Is it over? I considered the question. Almost. What's left? The slow part. Legal processes rarely move as quickly as the initial collapse. Charges, depositions, financial recovery, public statements. But the structural outcome had already been decided. Daniel's control of the company was finished. His access to the accounts was gone. And the poisoning investigation had moved into the hands of people who handle those things professionally. Over the next several weeks, the rest unfolded quietly. The auditors completed their review. 7 fraudulent transfers confirmed. Vendor manipulation documented. Internal emails recovered. The company board voted unanimously to remove Daniel from all operational authority. Most of the money was recovered through escrow holds. The rest would take longer. Emily moved into a larger apartment closer to the hospital. When the baby arrived, a boy she named Noah, I was there in the waiting room while the doctors worked. Hospitals have a way of resetting perspective. Machines humming, nurses moving calmly through hallways, people entering and leaving rooms that permanently change their lives. When the nurse finally came out and said both mother and baby were healthy, something inside me settled for the first time in months. Normal life returning. Emily let me hold Noah later that evening. He was small and warm and completely unaware of the institutional machinery that had been grinding around his arrival. You saved us, she said quietly. I shook my head. No. What do you mean? I just followed the paperwork. She smiled softly. A few months later, the company stabilized again. The audits finished. New leadership stepped in. Most employees never realized how close things had come to collapse. That's another thing institutions do well. They absorb damage quietly. Sometimes I still think about that night at Belmere House. The moment when I almost signed the contract and walked away from the corridor. It would have been easy. Much easier than everything that followed. Some people mistake silence for permission. Daniel made that mistake. He believed my patience meant surrender. He believed the company was already his, but systems have long memories. And paperwork, when someone finally reads it carefully, tends to reveal the truth. These days my schedule is lighter. I still review reports now and then. But most mornings I walk the park paths near Emily's building while Noah rides in a stroller beside me. He's starting to laugh now. A quiet, surprised laugh. The kind that reminds you the future does not belong to the people who try to take it. It belongs to the people who are still here when the paperwork settles. And if stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay.